There is an undeniable collective feeling when an individual is out in the deep wilderness. Particularly at night, we become highly responsive to even the quietest of sounds, that even the snap of a twig might make us flinch. It's something about being isolated within the forest that draws our fight or flight response back to our primal urges of survival. The fear of someone or something watching us out there is usually not warranted, but sometimes bad luck strikes and individuals have met horrible situations out in the heart of the wilderness. In this video, I'm going to be covering 3 true stories of horrifying wilderness encounters. I hope you enjoy. Before I begin, a quick disclaimer. These stories follow themes of death and horror, so if that sounds too gruesome for you, then viewer discretion is advised. Otherwise, enjoy the video. The Klein Falls State Park has an interesting history. Originally, the area was acquired by the Highway Commission in 1936 to serve as a gravel pit. But much to the happiness of wilderness and nature enjoyers, it was instead acquired by the Oregon State Parks Division in 1956. This kept the area in its pristine condition. The Cline Falls area is characterized by its small 9-acre property. But despite this, many come here to view small waterfalls along the Deschutes River and spend time relaxing on the riverfront lawn of the park. For well over 20 years, the Klein Falls Park was a small jewel within rural Deschutes County that would provide visitors with peace and an escape from the stress of everyday life. But in 1977, this would all change. 19-year-old Terry Jentz and 20-year-old Ava Goldman were 2 Yale University students. To get some excitement and adventure for the summer, the 2 embarked on a cross-country biking trip from Astoria, Oregon to the East Coast. The first 7 days were filled with laughs and breathtaking views out in the Oregon wilderness, and the 2 believed the trip was shaping up to be something they would remember for the rest of their lives. But on the 7th night of their trip, someone would put an end to all of this. June 22nd, 1977, on a peaceful summer night, Terry and Ava set up their camp on the banks of the Cline Falls Park. The women were exhausted after a long day on the trail, and as a result, the 2 of them went to sleep within their tent for what they assumed would be an uneventful night. Around 11:30 p.m., the 2 were abruptly awakened by a crushing force. The 2 women collided with the tires of a truck that tore through their tent and crushed them underneath. Terry was trapped underneath the tires as both of her arms and several ribs broke from the weight, as well as suffering a collapsed lung. Terry and Ava were understandably in a state of shock. Within the moments, they could hear the car door of a truck close and footsteps begin to approach. An unknown, axe-wielding man emerged from the darkness and took 6 swipes downward with the axe and struck Ava's skull. He then moved over to Terry as she begged him to leave, saying, quote, "Take anything but leave us alone." The man took a singular strike down at Terry, who despite having 2 broken arms, caught the axe with her hand, protecting her heart. Then the man withdrew the axe and re-entered his truck and drove away. Terry, despite all of her injuries, was able to make her way over to a nearby road and flag down 2 young high school students who happened to be driving past at that moment. The 3 of them then drove back to the campsite, where they began to tend to Ava, who was badly injured. Within a few minutes, a set of headlights emerged from the edge of the park. The injured group then gathered in terror, as they assumed it was the axe-wielding man returning to finish the job. But after a few moments, the vehicle turned away and disappeared down the road. Thankfully, both Terry and Ava would survive and recover from their injuries. Ava was unfortunately left with permanent visual problems due to the severe head trauma she suffered during the attack. Police arrived shortly after midnight and began to investigate the scene. Unfortunately, Ava, having suffered extreme head trauma, remembered nothing of the attack, and Terry simply couldn't see the man's face and only remembered that the assailant was a young, physically fit individual and was dressed like a cowboy. Police investigated a suspect named Richard Dom, who matched the description of the attacker. A local woman tipped the authorities off that Dom had gotten into a fight with his girlfriend that same night, and according to locals, this was not an uncommon occurrence for him. Dom would be interviewed and polygraphed several times with inconclusive results. His girlfriend even claimed that Dom changed the tires on his truck a few days after the crime, and confirmed that he had been physically abusive throughout their relationship. Another investigator from Salem would even go on record saying that Dom's polygraph results did show deception. Despite this evidence, it simply was not enough to merit an arrest, let alone a case against the man. The case would turn cold 3 years after the crime. In the early 2000s, Terry would return to the town of her attack, only to discover that most of the evidence and photographs of her attack had been lost. If you'd like to hear more from Terry, she wrote a book detailing her life after the attack called Strange Piece of Paradise. In present day, the identity of the Cline Falls axe attacker is still at large, and we have no idea what drove that individual to attack 2 sleeping campers in the middle of the night. In the year of 2008, 2 friends named Scott Johnston and Sean Farmer took a trip out to the Appalachian Mountains to enjoy some fishing. The 2 were no strangers to the Appalachian Trail, a hiking trail in the eastern United States that sprawls over 2,200 miles of gorgeous temperate mountains and stunning views. Scott and Sean arrived at Dismal Creek, a favorite spot of the 2 on the trail, and started what seemed to be a fun and relaxing vacation away from the hustle of everyday life. On the morning of May 6th, Scott Johnston woke up early to get a start on some fishing without Sean. The 2 planned on meeting up later in the day back at the campsite, but for the time being, he was on his own. While fishing, Scott met another fisher who went by Ricky Williams. Scott, being the friendly man he was, spent the day with the rather scraggly and unkempt man. The 2 reportedly caught a good number of bass, then Scott invited Ricky to enjoy some dinner back at his campsite. Ricky arrived at the campsite a bit before Scott, as Sean was getting the fire ready for a nice evening's meal. The 2 chatted for a bit as Scott arrived back. Within a few minutes, the 3 men were eating, exchanging stories, and sharing laughs with each other. As the sun began to descend past the evergreen trees, Ricky got to his feet and said goodbye to the 2 men, then walked out of the campsite. Everything seemed to be turning down until Scott heard an ear-piercing blast. Quickly, he turned his head to the edge of camp and saw Ricky holding a .22 pistol. Scott turned to look at Sean, who had been shot across the face and was staggering, but had not fallen to his feet. Then Ricky turned the pistol towards him, and right before he could shoot, Scott took off in a full-out sprint towards a grouping of trees. At some point during the sprint, Ricky fired off a shot that connected with Scott's neck. He continued to run and didn't realize he was shot until he reached the trees and stopped to catch his breath. He turned back and saw Sean charging Ricky, but before he could reach him, the 6'4" imposing man was shot once again, this one into his chest. Sean did not fall, but in response, he took off running towards where their Jeep was parked. Scott caught wind of this and silently made his way back to the road to meet up with him. Not long after, Sean started the Jeep and the 2 packed their way into the car and sped off down the windy mountainous road. It wasn't until the 2 were speeding away down the road that Scott noticed he had also been shot a second time in his back. Being 40 miles away from the nearest hospital, and Sean finding it increasingly difficult to drive with blood pooling around his eye due to the gunshot wound to the face, the 2 men stopped about 6 miles away from their campsite at a local home and pleaded for help. Thankfully, the homeowner was in fact home and was able to contact authorities for help. The 2 men would fortunately survive their wounds. Sean was told that the .22 bullet stopped in his sinus cavity before the bullet could reach his brain, and the second shot to the chest was thankfully diverted by his muscle mass before it could make fatal contact with his heart. The cops would then go on to locate Scott's truck, as Ricky had stolen it after his crime. Ricky would attempt to kill himself by driving the car off an embankment. Luckily, he wouldn't get off this easy and would survive his attempt. Upon being brought into custody, police realized that Ricky Williams was actually a man named Randall Lee Smith, a convicted killer. Smith had previously been caught in 1981 when he killed 2 hikers around the same area that Sean and Scott had been camping in. But for some reason, he was paroled in 1996. After locating Smith's remote campsite, they found several strange items. Police found a cassette tape that contained, quote, some sort of satanic ritual, several pairs of women's underwear, a plastic map mold of the area with several areas marked, and well over a dozen knives. Strange enough, Smith would die of natural causes just 4 days after his arrest, leaving this trial and crime investigation at a dead end. Despite this terrifying encounter, Scott and Sean still frequent the Appalachian Trail together to this very day. The date is Saturday, February 7th, 1970. Eugene Smith, leader of Boy Scout Troop 95, led 3 of his scouts on what seemed to be a fun-filled hike through the Appalachian Mountains. The group planned on spending the night camping up on the mountains to enjoy the natural beauty of the area. The scouts, Lee Smith, Steve Wolf, and Geoff Hague, were all in their teenage years and were excited for a chance to get outdoors. Also accompanying the group were 2 assistant scout leaders, there to also provide aid and a guiding hand in case the troop needed it. The trip went off without a hitch on day 1, but on the return trip, something disastrous occurred. At a junction in the trail, Geoff stopped and explained that he wanted to take a rest, and the group could go on without him. After some debate, the leaders decided it was okay since the car was only a few minutes away from where they were, so they allowed Geoff to stay at the junction while they carried forward and awaited the 2 boys' arrival at the car. Little did the group know this would be the last time any of them would ever see Geoff again. Geoff never did arrive back at the car, and panic quickly ensued as a result. On top of this, snowfall began to pick up, and with that, temperatures began to drop. A search ensued that would involve hundreds of people, Green Berets, and canine units. As the group scoured the nearby forest in nearly sub-zero weather, they would find the crumpled body of Geoff Hague 3 days after his disappearance. It seemed at some point, Geoff left the trail and descended towards the Waterprong stream. Geoff then followed the stream for about half a mile, then set up his belongings nearby. According to those investigating the case, it seems that Geoff wanted to go back to the Boulevard Trail, but at this point it seems that he wasn't in a clear headspace, and began to walk in circles, until eventually he slipped and fell roughly 20 feet. This fall did not kill him or break any bones, but it seems that it was enough for Geoff to stop moving altogether and eventually die. Geoff's items were located back at his makeshift camp, neatly stacked upon a rock. According to forums I've read, most of Geoff's actions make sense. Most young scouts and wilderness explorers are taught if you ever get lost, follow the water. So Geoff setting up a base camp along a river makes sense. But the mystery lies in why he decided to leave the trail in the first place. One likely possibility was that Geoff willingly decided to leave the trail. According to scout leader Eugene Smith, the 3 teenage boys had gotten into a snowball fight the night prior to his disappearance. Smith had reportedly disciplined the boys as a result. Geoff seemed disturbed after the reprimanding. As a result, many investigators have boiled his disappearance into a simple action of protest against Smith. It seems this explanation has been widespread among those who took to investigating it, but some claim it makes no sense. David Paulides, an American investigator and author, claims that for Geoff to walk off of a well-marked trail and descend roughly 1,000 feet in the cold weather towards a drainage stream makes no sense. Some claim that Geoff was attempting to reach the US 441 highway, which is in view of the trail, but several miles away. Whatever Geoff's thought process was here, we will likely never know considering the case is well over 50 years old. But the prospect of a teenage boy leaving a well-marked trail in the middle of the wilderness still leaves many scratching their head to this day. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing and checking out some of my other content. Have a great day. Goodbye.